Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Well, the US election has been called. For the first time in about 130 years, you will have a president, that is Donald Trump, coming back to the White House after losing it in a second term, right? And this is an interesting time. But what does it mean for the world at large? And to discuss this, I have with me two of our finest guests. Yes, I'm talking about Sana Hashmi, who is a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, and Swati Rao, a geopolitical expert who focuses majorly on Europe. Welcome to The Print, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sana, first question to you. What does Trump 2.0 mean for the world? And specifically, what does it mean for China?
I think a short answer is that it's going to be chaotic and unpredictable. I think a lot of countries, including China, they are just thinking how to navigate the Trump 2.0 and how to deal with Trump. And then, of course, countries have dealt with Trump before, but then I think he's definitely going to be different this time. So I think specifically from Chinese perspective, they were expecting Harris to come back in a way that there were signs of improvement in US-China relationship. So perhaps they're just trying to navigate what is going to be Trump's China policy and how it is going to impact China-US relation. But the expectations are not very positive from the Chinese side as of now.
So, what you're saying is that the Chinese would have preferred, Xi Jinping would have preferred Kamala Harris over Trump.
And then I don't think, because there is a consensus that no matter who's there at the White House, the rivalry, the geopolitical rivalry is going to be there, is going to be intact. Of course, the nature of the rivalry, the nature of the outreach towards China, competition is definitely going to be different from Trump as well as from Harris. But the nature of the relation is going to be the same. The rivalry is going to be there. So no matter who's there, China has to deal with a very difficult situation with respect to China-US relations.
So, but continuing with this question, you are someone who's very focused on China, based in Taiwan. And Trump, in his first presidency, he didn't really have much nice things to say about the whole Taiwan dependency on the US. How's Taiwan taking this?
I think this time I am not really seeing a lot of overt uneasiness with respect to the elections. There's a lot of emphasis on self sufficiency. Of course, it's a long way to go when it comes to developing their own military capabilities. And if you look at it, even from the Trump people who were in the Trump administration, the scholars who are kind of Republican, we have seen that they have been asking Taiwan to step up, that Taiwan is not doing enough. But
Yeah.
then we also have to keep in mind that if you look at the development in the US Taiwan relationship, there were a lot of positive development that took place during Trump first administration. With respect to the arms sales, it primarily accelerated during Trump 1.0. And with respect to the official visit, for the very first time, high-ranking officials in decades visited Taiwan during Trump administration. So I do believe that when it comes to Taiwan, Biden administration was more open about it, but then it was also some sort of continuity from Biden administration, Trump administration. So I don't think that is going to be any different. Of course, the how Trump is and how he is so unpredictable when it comes to his talking about China and Taiwan is definitely going to be there. But we also have to understand that there have been some understanding with respect to Taiwan from the US, and there is bipartisan support for Taiwan. So I don't think it's going to be as difficult. Of course, what they have to deal with is this unpredictability, this notion that Trump perhaps is going to be harsher on Taiwan. And of course, we as of now we do not know what is Trump 2.0 China policy is going to be. But all in all, I don't see there's not a lot of unease with respect to Trump.
So, Swasti, Sana is, telling us that Xi Jinping is not a happy man, but she's also making it clear that Xi Jinping is also not a sad man. But now, moving on to your region, the region that you specialize in, do you think Putin is a very happy man today, and is he smiling?
Well, yes, I mean, Putin is definitely relieved, even if he's not smiling, because and the factor there being Trump's unpredictability and the statements that he's been making. I think we also need to understand a little better that Trump's entire campaign has been about projecting himself as a problem solver versus the Democrats as the problem makers. The guys who are constantly getting into wars, and he's the one who's getting all the boys back home. So he's been trying to project it as that binary. Now, when it comes to Europe, and also, I think I'm happy Sana mentioned about Taiwan because a lot of people, and especially scholars like Elbridge Colby, or for example, scholars like John Mearsheimer, they've said it again and again that America should be focused only on the Indo Pacific if it wants to counter China. But then you also had Trump come and say that fine, but even for that, Taiwan has to step up its own securitization, its own security capabilities, and has to spend more. So I guess that is the lasting takeaway that we need to remember from Trump, which is that Trump is going to make his style of politics and American involvement in the rest of the world very, very transactionalist. And in Europe, they've been preparing for it. That is what has been known as Trump proofing themselves. Now, you can always get into the details of what exactly those measures are. There are certain measures which will help Europe bolster its security and defense over a longer period of time, but may not really help Ukraine right away. The second point is about this realization in Europe that they do need somebody like a Trump to come and give them the Trump pill so that they are able to get up from the dividend, peace era, peace dividend era, and sort of face their realities and start really spending on their security capabilities. Because we know that the biggest economies of Europe, like Germany, never really, completed their 2% that of their GDPs as NATO,
Yeah.
requirements. So they never did it, and they wanted somebody like Trump to actually come and do it. Otherwise, they would have fallen back into the slumber. So very quickly, and I think the last point is about Ukraine. That a lot of people don't understand again is that Trump will not come and just stop the war like that. I don't think he really has a plan. But what he has in mind is that he is going to make it more transactional. I have been saying in writing for a long time that he might actually activate the Lend Lease agreement that the Biden era administration, I mean, the Biden administration had signed but never really activated because Biden usually only used the presidential drawdown authority to actually take out money for Ukraine. So the Lend Lease agreement is something by which the US has been entering into these into these modes of lending its allies money. And that is what we've seen with the UK, I mean, across the world wars as well. So he might actually do that because, frankly, the argument is that if the war in Ukraine and if America's military assistance to Ukraine is helping build America's economy, so end of the day, that kind of a transactionalist but conservative internationalism is something that I expect from Trump, not a complete isolationism or a complete globalism that we might have expected from Kamala Harris. So I guess there would be a bit of a middle way. But yes, the fact that Trump has gone on record again and again saying that he can bring the war to an end obviously gives Russians a kind of a leverage. And if you see the Russian strategy in the war is that before the coming of Trump, they tried to put in everything they had to take, to capture these key cities and to make these advances, especially in the key areas of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. And
Yeah.
that probably was very, very evident. So I guess Russia is also somewhere preparing for now that they will be able to negotiate from a position of strength where earlier things could have been different. But all of this could radically change, Snehesh, and that is perhaps the thing that I want to make, what that I want to bring everybody's attention to is that despite all this talk, despite all the transactionalism, and despite everything, all the claims that he has made, he remains an unpredictable man. And this is something which is shared across Europe, whether you speak to Ukrainians or to Poles or to Estonians, people in the Baltics or people in mid Europe, for example, in Germany or elsewhere, that his unpredictability is a factor which is going to keep the entire continent on tenterhooks. And obviously, that is not good news for Ukraine. Yes.
Absolutely. One of the first person to congratulate, one of the first world leader to congratulate Trump was, of course, Zelensky himself.
Yeah.
He's put out a long
Oh,
post. But
sorry.
what is interesting is
Yeah.
what the French president has tweeted, Emmanuel Macron, and he tweeted it before the elections were actually called. And I read out, he says, "Congratulations, President Real Donald Trump, ready to work together as we did for 4 years. with your convictions and mine, with respect and ambition for more peace and prosperity. So I think the French are really making it clear that it's your convictions as well as theirs, and with respect and ambition. So that's something that they're laying the ground rules.
Snehesh, there's something very important that we need to understand here, that a lot of people in India typically understand Macron's and Donald Trump's relationship as very straight. And if you remember, that was the era when Macron called NATO brain dead, and Donald Trump said that why should we be, doing all this and we don't have any business in Europe and all that.
Yeah.
So I guess what we need to understand better is that even though these countries and these leaders would have their own differences when it comes to tackling their security issues, but end of the day, there is no getting away from the fact that today, if America wants to take on China, it cannot do it alone and it needs the support of its allies. And when it needs the support of its allies, end of the day, it also needs to accommodate the crises and the anxieties of its allies. So Europe, I mean, it's a cluster of these big economies and formidable, I would say, also military industrial complex. Of course, because of the war in Ukraine and because they have not really changed the way they spend. So their social spending model has not really changed, contrary to what we see in Russia, where we see a war economy. But the fact of the matter remains that the transatlantic alliance is going to stay. Yes, somebody like Trump was needed to really force these guys to start spending on the security, which they were not willing to do earlier, especially countries like Germany. And this is something that obviously they would not like, because these kind of rectifications and adjustments are very painful in the short term. But in the longer term, you see that these measures of Trump proofing have already started to come in place. But what I'm worried about is that they may not really be able to rise up to the occasion, because their best case scenarios unfold only by 2030, which means that
Yeah.
whatever investments they're doing now, whatever, all this going together and, let's be together for our security, all of this translates, even in the best case scenario, to changes by 2030. That is where the European defense industrial strategy and the European defense industrial program, I mean, those kind of things will start showing the results only by then. And
Only by
of
then.
course, that's not really good news for Ukraine. So if you look at it for European security, sans Ukraine, I think Europe is good. So NATO is not going to go anywhere. Europeans will become more activated about their security interests. But when it comes to Ukraine, of course, it becomes very clear by the day that Ukraine will have to cede territory, and Ukraine will have to, perhaps also try and not lose more men, and especially as now we really cannot be very predictable about what kind of American aid is going to come. I mean, for all you know,
Okay.
there may be a doubling down, but again, unpredictability is probably keeping people.
Unpredictability of it.
Yeah.
Sana, one of the big focus of Trump's first administration about was how he looked at China, right? He spoke about the China Plus initiative. How do you think that is going to play out? Do you expect a tariff battle that will go on with China?
I think tariff is his favorite word, and this is something that I'm hearing from on a lot of platform. He is,
Well,
and
he
I
called India a tariff abuser too.
I think there is no one who's actually kind of escaped from that. And actually, someone called him a tariff king as well. I don't know where I read it. So it's definitely going to be that this is something he cannot really live without talking about. We don't know how much impact it is going to be on the ground, but also what we are not really taking into consideration is that Elon Musk's support and how pro China he is and how pro business with China he is. And he also thanked him during his victory speech just an hour ago. So my point is, so we have to see with respect to business, with respect to economic ties, how he's going to be. I'm pretty sure that he's not going to be as hawkish as he was before,
Acha.
specifically with respect to economic ties. But we have to see. But definitely, this is his style. The tech war, the trade war, and trying to tech and supply chain decoupling is definitely going to be there during his second administration as well. But I think more than that, we also have to focus on how he's going to be focusing on a strategic threat that is emanating from China and the Indo Pacific. And I think we have to really talk about if the Indo Pacific is going to be intact with Trump 2.0. And of course, there were the quad at the senior official level was rejuvenated when he was there, and the all talks about the Indo-Pacific. But then the initiatives that were taken in the US were primarily by the Biden administration. So what is going to happen? So I do believe that China is more looking at that rather than the economic tariffs and how is it going to impact US-China relationship. I do feel that perhaps at some level it is easier for China to deal with Trump in a way that there are no systematic mechanisms to contain China's economic rise when it specifically during Trump 1.0. And if we talk about Biden administration, there were dedicated systematic processes to deal with China economically. You look at IPEF, you look at collective responses, you look at like-minded countries collaboration, but that was primarily absent during Trump 1.0. It might be there, but I do not think it will be as coordinated as it was during Biden administration. So it definitely there are pros and cons with respect to China, and China is definitely looking at some kind of window of opportunity. But strategically, if you look at it, there is definitely a window of opportunity. What perhaps Trump is going to do is he's definitely going to talk more about burden sharing that he talked about during 1.0. So this is definitely going to be leaving some space for China to maneuver, to reach out to these countries that US is not as reliable as it used to be, and now you have to discuss cooperation with us. You have to perhaps let go talks of decoupling or de-risking. So this is something that I think China is going to do, but I think for now, wait and watch kind of approach is going to be there from the Chinese side, and see how Trump is going to uh, be with China.
So, you mentioned about the Indo-Pacific, and that's something that I wanted to talk about. Now, you have the Pacific Initiative, which India is part of, which is on one side it is led by China, and on this side it is led by the US. But Trump has spoken about it. Do you fear this grouping? What happens to Quad, and what happens to the other initiative that has been taken, Sana, in your sense?
I think Quad should be there, should stay, and I think this is a catchphrase that we have been hearing with respect to Quad, and I'm saying it primarily because the Quad was rejuvenated during his first term. So he wanted to focus on the Indo Pacific, and the primary idea was to perhaps kind of contain China's rise. So that definitely came from Trump 1.0. So I'm not uh, really pessimistic about the Indo Pacific. But of course, I'm not very sure if IPF is going to be there. Specifically, it was started by the Biden administration, and how Trump
Exactly.
has been against IPF. There might be, and also he's not very pro trade and economic institutional framework. So it might be there, it might not be there, but it might not be there in its current form. It might occupy a new position, a new format, but definitely not in the current format. But I do believe that his focus on the Indo Pacific will be there. Uh, and it's just not because of China, it's also because how he sees countries such as France, such as India. And India is an important component of the Indo Pacific region. Of course, bilaterally, we are seeing that there is a lot of cooperation, no matter who's there at the White House. But I do believe that Indo Pacific is definitely going to be there, and it's primarily because he would definitely want to engage India, Japan, Australia at the bilateral level as well as within the regional context as well.
Okay. Swasti, when it comes to Trump, what impact do you think Trump will have on the domestic politics in Europe itself? Now, Trump represents a strong right wing, this thing, and in Europe, you've already seen the rise of the right wing, right, compared to the traditional setup. So, do you see any kind of impact that Trump could have in Europe politically, or the Trump's rise?
Well, I mean, please, we have to understand that the reasons for the rise of the far right, it's not just right wing, it's far right. Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
there are a lot of leaders in Europe that belong to the conservative spectrum, and they are not necessarily far right. So we're referring to far right. For example, we're referring to Marie Le Pen in France. We're referring to Giorgia Meloni. We're Brothers of Italy. We're referring to Dutch Wilders. We're referring to these kind of AFD in Germany, Alternative for
Yeah.
Deutschland. We're referring to these kind of parties. They form the spectrum. On the far right of the spectrum. That's why they're called far right. Now, the reasons for the rise of far right in Europe are different. I mean, they are there because there has been this. this influx of millions of refugees. There has been a crisis of law and order. And generally, I think the European project and its liberal values are under attack, and they are in trouble because they have not been able to deliver. And the far right, one of the key characteristics of the far right, actually comes from populist politics, where where they subvert every single rule of law institution, where they say that anybody that's democratically elected is a basically is has landed up being an elite, and it's people like us who are from the soil, son of the soils, who are going to come and actually solve these problems. So that that tadka of populism is very, very evident whenever you think about far right, and it is very much there in Europe as well. Now, it's a different thing that the same far right people, the same far right leaders, when they really become, heads of the state, like in the case of Georgia Meloni, you also see that their rhetoric then sort of balances out itself more evenly, and they become more realistic in terms of
Yeah.
their approach. Now, so whether Trump coming would have a positive impact on the rise of right wing in Europe or the far right in Europe, I would say, regardless of who comes in the US, there would be a rise of far right in Europe, because Europe is not able to solve or address its structural problems. Okay, when it comes to the spending model, when it comes to whether they want to support Ukraine or not support Ukraine, all the economic troubles that they're going through, all this this takeover by the millions of refugees from a certain area, that has become a problem out there. It has become a law and governance problem. So I would say it's regardless of Trump. Even if Kamala Harris had come, we would still see, yes, on the face of it, everybody would say that yes, the European project is safer because the transatlantic alliance is, etched in stone and all of that. But I think the reality on the ground is different. So I would say regardless of Trump. But just one thing about the Indo Pacific Initiative I'd like to say, please let's keep in mind, when we're having this discussion, is that the kind of world Donald Trump inherited in 2016 is a radically different world today in 2024. When he came
Absolutely.
in 2016, there was no COVID, there was no Galvan, there was no Hong Kong, for instance, there was no Ukraine, there was no Hamas attack on Israel. So the kind of world he inherits today is also radically different. Everybody understands, even somebody who's as transactionalist as Trump understands the value of economic security and friend shoring. Okay, so I would say that, and just one thing about IPEF. IPEF is not just a free trade agreement, by the way. IPEF has four
It was
pillars,
never
and
a
one
free
of
trade agreement.
no,
Yeah.
it has. IPEF has four pillars. One of the pillars is a free trade agreement, and the three other pillars are about, connectivity, and about standards,
Yeah.
and about, those kind of things, infrastructure. India is a signatory to the other three pillars of IPEF. India
Not the
is
trade.
not yet a signatory of the
Yeah.
FTA, and India is wary of that. So I do agree that with Trump back in power, by the way, don't forget that even in the Biden administration, you had already started to see, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the Shields Act, with the Chips Act, for example, that they had already started this friendshoring, and their attitude had also become protectionist. So with Trump back, we would perhaps think that obviously protectionism and transactionalism is going to be the order of the day, maybe, but not in a very absolutist sense, because this is a world which is a radically different world. And if America needs to sort of also bank upon, not just as allies and also domestically, etc., they really have to get very real. It cannot really be only campaign, election rhetoric and this and that. So I am of the view that Trump will take a more nuanced stance of where he is in the world today. And I've also argued that I do not see any drastic measures when it comes to these international scenarios. Like foreign policy decisions would not be drastically different. There would be some change, of course. We would perhaps the first theater to feel that change would definitely be Ukraine and Europe. But then eventually, because there is an axis between China in the Indo-Pacific, Russia in Europe, North Korea again in the Indo-Pacific, and Iran in West Asia, because of this crink axis, I guess the kind of responses that we expect from anybody that is trying to counter that axis can also be more rational than, I would say, unpredictable. But nonetheless, I'll come back and say I would still not ever take away from Trump that he's very unpredictable.
Well, that's something that neither anyone can take away from Trump. Sana, the last question to you and to point to you. You've been noticing the Chinese media. You've been noticing the Taiwanese media. Of course, the Indian media is covering the U.S. elections as it covers Indian elections. What is the feedback from the Chinese and the Taiwanese media there?
I think Taiwanese media is just trying to take everything in, because I think in 2020 they were not Taiwanese media, but primarily the perception in Taiwan was that Donald Trump should come back because how hawkish he was on China.
Yeah.
So, of course, Biden administration also showed, and in fact, he at a number of occasions said that there is a responsibility for the U.S. to support Taiwan. So that was something that changed their perception that no matter what, there is bipartisan support in the U.S. for Taiwan. And now I think they kind of played low key. There was hardly any discussion with respect to what their preference has been with
Okay.
respect to the candidate. Media is just trying to report in Taiwan, but in China, there is a lot of there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of unpredictability with respect to who they want to support and who they're actually supporting. So, but I think one of the things that I noticed that they were kind of cherishing the kind of stability they face in China and how democracy in the US, who's a preacher of democracy, and they are showcasing to the world that it is so messy that now, there have been civil unrest in the US, and this is something that doesn't happen in China. But apart from that, I think there has been no expectation with respect to how it is going to change the US policy with respect to China. And this is something that's consensus across all the media, strategic community, even Weibo, that no matter what happens, the perhaps the style of diplomacy might change, but there might not be substantive changes with respect to China. So no matter what you are reading, where you're reading, this is the consensus on the Chinese internet. So there is no expectation. They're ready for whatever comes and whatever Trump says and does with respect to China.
So it's like a wait and watch. Actually, it's a wait and watch for everyone except I think for Putin. But thank you so much, both of you, for joining here at this discussion. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Okay, bye.